In a storage room in the British Museum sits a set of stone panels, carved almost 2,700 years ago, showing a walled city on fire. Soldiers are impaling captives, families are being marched out in chains. It is, without question, one of the most violent pieces of art to survive from the ancient Near East. It was carved by order of the man who conquered the city, to decorate his own palace. As a boast, he labeled it himself, in cuneiform, so there'd be no confusion about which city he'd just erased. And the label matches a city named 44 times in the Book of Kings. The Assyrians didn't know they were building evidence. They thought they were bragging. This is buried scripture, where we take the cities, texts, and relics of the biblical world and check them against what's actually come out of the ground. No sermon, no debunking, just the paper trail. 8 cities, 8 excavation reports. Let's start with the one that got burned. 8 Lachish, the wall that agrees with the war. The city in that Assyrian relief is Lachish, and the panels were found in 1849 by Austin Henry Layard in the ruins of Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, pulled out of the ground roughly 27 centuries after they were carved. Excavations at the actual site of Lachish, led by British archaeologist James Starkey in the 1930s, and continued by Israeli archaeologist David Usishkin from the 1970s onward, uncovered the siege ramp Assyrian engineers built to breach the walls still there, still measurable, one of the oldest siege ramps ever documented anywhere on Earth. 2 Kings 18 says Sennacherib came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. The relief, the ramp, and the text are describing the same afternoon from 3 completely different angles. This is the rare case where the boasting empire, the biblical scribe, and the dirt all tell the same story, which is exactly why the next one is more interesting, because it's the one where the dirt disagreed with everybody. 7. Hazor, the layer of ash nobody expected to find. Hazor, in northern Israel, was the largest Bronze Age city in the entire region, big enough that the book of Joshua singles it out as the head of all those kingdoms. Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin excavated it in the 1950s and found something specific, a destruction layer dated to the late 13th century BC, with temples deliberately smashed and statues of Canaanite deities decapitated, not looted, not accidentally burned, but methodically desecrated. Yadin's successor, Amnon Ben-Tor, who has led the dig since the 1990s, has called it one of the most violent destructions found anywhere in the Bronze Age Levant. Joshua 11:13 says Israel burned Hazor and Hazor alone among the northern cities. Whether Joshua's army did the burning is a genuinely open scholarly argument, but somebody burned this specific city, on purpose, around this specific time, and left the neighboring cities standing. The Bible predicted exactly that pattern before anyone dug it up. 6. Tel Dan, 4 words that shouldn't exist. In 1993, on a broken piece of basalt at Tel Dan in northern Israel, archaeologist Avraham Biran's team found an inscription written by a 9th century BC Aramean king, boasting about a battle he'd won. Ordinary enough until the translation came back. The stone contains the phrase, "Beat David," the house of David. It is, to this day, the earliest known reference to King David outside the Bible, carved by one of Israel's enemies, less than a century and a half after David is supposed to have lived not by a fan, not by a scribe with an agenda, but by a rival king who had no reason to invent a rival dynasty to brag about defeating. For decades, some scholars had argued David was likely a legend with no more historical weight than King Arthur. This one broken stone didn't end that argument entirely, but it moved the goalposts permanently, and it wasn't the last inscription that would do that. 5. Megiddo, the argument that's still going. Megiddo overlooks the Jezreel Valley, the flattest, most fought-over stretch of land in the ancient Near East, so strategically important that Armageddon is just a Greek mangling of its name, Har Megiddo. Excavated since the 1920s by the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute and later by Yigael Yadin and Israel Finkelstein, the site has produced monumental gate structures and stables or possibly storehouses that Yadin dated to Solomon's reign in the 10th century BC. Finkelstein's low chronology pushes the same structures a century later, to the Omride dynasty instead. This is not a case of archaeology proving or disproving scripture. It's a live, ongoing dispute among credentialed excavators about exactly whose fingerprints are on the same stones. What both camps agree on is that someone with serious state resources built a fortified administrative city here, exactly where the text says a kingdom's power was being flexed. The disagreement is about the name on the receipt, not whether the receipt exists. For Nineveh, the city everyone assumed was a myth. For over 2,000 years, Nineveh existed only in the Bible, and in Greek legend, a city so implausibly vast that most 18th century scholars assumed it was invented. Then in 1849, the same Austin Henry Layard who'd later find the Lachish reliefs uncovered Nineveh's actual ruins outside modern Mosul, Iraq palaces, libraries, walls over 7 miles around. In the library of King Ashurbanipal, excavators found thousands of clay tablets, including a flood narrative predating Genesis. More recently, ongoing excavation at Nineveh's Shamash Gate has uncovered the physical destruction layer from the city's fall in 612 BC, arrowheads, ash, collapsed fortifications matching the fall of Nineveh, prophesied in the books of Nahum and Zephaniah, almost line for line. A city the Enlightenment had quietly filed under mythology, turned out to have a filing cabinet of its own, several stories tall, still standing under the sand. 3. Capernaum, the house that got a church built on top of it. Capernaum, on the Sea of Galilee, is named as Jesus' base of operations in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Franciscan archaeologists Virgilio Corbo and Stanislao Lafreda excavated the site from the 1960s onward and found something unusual directly beneath a later, more elaborate church, a modest first-century house, with walls too thin and roughly built to have supported a normal second story, the kind of house you'd only keep reinforcing and repairing, generation after generation, if people kept treating it as significant. Layered above it, they found evidence of continuous Christian veneration going back to at least the 4th century, eventually formalized into an octagonal church built directly over the house's exact footprint. Nobody can prove whose house it originally was. What the excavation proves is that someone in Capernaum, within a few centuries of the Gospels being written, believed strongly enough in the location that they built increasingly permanent architecture on top of one specific, ordinary room and never moved it. 2. Ai, the city with a 500-year problem. The book of Joshua describes the conquest of Ai in vivid, specific detail right after Jericho. For most of the 20th century, the leading candidate site for Ai, It-Tel, showed no signs of occupation at all during the period the conquest is supposed to have happened, a genuine and much discussed problem for a straightforward reading of the text. Then, starting in the 1990s, archaeologist Bryant Wood proposed a different site half a mile away, Khirbet El Makatir, and excavations there continued under Scott Stripling into the 2010s, uncovered a fortified structure and a destruction layer that Wood and Stripling argue fits the late Bronze Age timeframe far better. Other archaeologists remain unconvinced, and the identification is still contested. This is the entry that doesn't resolve cleanly, and that's worth sitting with for a moment, because the next one on this list is the site where the disagreement gets even louder and even more consequential. 1. Tal el Hammam, the city that may have ended in fire from the sky. In the Jordan Valley, northeast of the Dead Sea, sits Tal el Hammam, a Bronze Age city so large it dwarfed Jerusalem at the time. Archaeologist Stephen Collins has led excavations there since 2005 and argues it's the best surviving candidate for biblical Sodom, a thriving city that ends, abruptly, around 1650 BC, in a destruction layer showing evidence of extreme, instantaneous heat pottery surfaces melted into glass, mud bricks vitrified on their exterior while remaining unfired inside. A 2021 study published in Scientific Reports proposed the destruction was consistent with an airburst event, comparable in scale to Tunguska. Other archaeologists dispute both the Sodom identification and elements of the airburst interpretation, and the site remains one of the more contested calls in biblical archaeology today. What isn't disputed is that a major city here ended suddenly, catastrophically, and by fire, which is precisely the detail Genesis insists on above every other. 8 cities, 8 separate excavation teams, working decades and sometimes continents apart, none of them setting out to prove a religious text. And 8 times, the ground gave up something that lines up imperfectly, argumentatively, but genuinely with what the text already said. That's not proof of everything in the Bible. It's not meant to be. The open question the evidence hasn't settled is simpler and more interesting. How does a set of ancient authors keep landing on real, verifiable geography and real, datable catastrophe, city after city, without once getting caught inventing one? Tell us which of these 8 you'd have bet against before you knew how it ended.